Good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Lavery. Welcome to the 9th in the Reducing Carbon in Commercial Interiors webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about how to convince others to act on climate change. As I mentioned, this is the 9th in the series. We've got one more to go on social value. All of them are available through the Ripe Office website in the Academy tab. And so let's dive in to talk about convincing others to act on climate change. Now, the first, I think, building block of that is understanding that climate change thinking is a belief and requires a change in beliefs for many people. So we've all lived in the suburbs, driven cars all our lives. They all happen to be fossil fuels. We've happily filled them up with fossil fuels. We've happily jetted around the world to go on holidays. We've lived a lifestyle that's very high carbon. We've eaten a lot of meat. And the consumption story goes on. However, the world is at a carrying capacity issue right now. So to believe that there is a problem, you have to believe that we're at some sort of set of limitations, whether it's around the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and the implications on climate change, whether it's about the other carrying capacity issues around biodiversity, plastics waste in the oceans and all those other issues. But you have to actually fundamentally challenge your own beliefs. And so we can think about the journey for changing beliefs analogous to some very big changes that have happened are called paradigm shifts historically. So let's take, for example, the heliocentric view of the world. So in the old days, pre-Copernicus, everyone believed that the Earth was the center of the solar system and everything rotated around it, including the sun. And you can see on the left-hand side that led to some pretty crazy mathematics about the behaviors of Mars, the red planet there, and the sun around the Earth. Then Copernicus came along and said, actually, I've got a better way of explaining all of this, and that is everything rotates around the sun. In his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn talked about the term paradigm shift. Now, we all use the word or the phrase paradigm shift quite a lot nowadays. Thomas Kuhn actually said, well, look, what this recognizes is that there's actually a major shift in thinking. He wrote about the whole structure of those revolutions as they occur, started in 1962 with his book. And this actually forms a fundamental framework that we can use to start thinking about changes in beliefs and and that transition process that we can then apply when talking and working with others to convince them to change their belief system to actually create a better world for everyone else. So let me continue the examination of Thomas Kuhn's work with this idea of the paradigm shift. Now, what Thomas Kuhn wrote about in his book, and this is, you can't quite see, or maybe you can see the reference down the bottom. This comes from my PhD. I spent 3 years in the 90s looking at the structure of scientific revolutions. And in fact, I'll talk you through what I studied in my PhD as we go through this, because it's really pertinent and was all about change. So what Thomas Kuhn described was 7 different features of what makes a paradigm shift. So first of all, crisis. So in the case of the heliocentric solar system, mathematics wasn't able to easily describe planetary motion if the Earth is the center of the solar system. There was a crisis around that Copernicus could solve then. Secondly, that paradigm shift, the situation, that crisis requires a return to first principles, as Copernicus did. Third feature of a paradigm shift is actually the new solution, or the new paradigm is a better solution to the original problem. And what Copernicus and Galileo found is all their maths all of a sudden worked if you put the sun at the center of the solar system. Another feature is the fact that there will be resistance, and so Copernicus's book was banned and Galileo was imprisoned for their idea of a heliocentric solar system. Followed by point 5, a gradual growth of support, and now it would be very difficult to find someone who actually believed anything other than the sun being the center of the solar system, which is point 6, that it's irreversible step change. No one ever has gone back and went, you know, originally we had that right, which for paradigms is one of its key features. And then finally, what Thomas Kuhn identified is that the new paradigm is incomplete when it's first conceptualized. And so in terms of astronomy, that heliocentric view of the solar system opened up a whole new branches of study into the science of astronomy that really, and Copernicus and Galileo really opened the door to a whole new world of research. So that's applied in a very strictly scientific revolution format, which is what Thomas Kuhn spoke about. What my PhD then did is said, well, look, can you apply those same principles to a paradigm shift to not just science, but also something architectural and engineering related, such as a modern movement in architecture? And so what I did is actually demonstrated that all of these 7 principles of a structural shift or a paradigm shift apply to the modern movement in architecture, where the crisis was at the time a lack of housing post-war when the modern movement started to emerge, return to first principles, re-examination of building materials, user requirements, design approaches, which led to a better solution being lower cost construction in terms of reinforced concrete, which emerged as a result of this new paradigm. And high-rise, steel framed high-rise skyscrapers and other multi-dwelling units. Resistance occurred. There are a lot of classicists out there that says every house must be 2 stories high with an attic in the Edwardian or Victorian style, you can imagine. Gradual growth of support. Le Corbusier was the first designer to develop what he called city in the sky, which became a high-rise housing building that then spread, and just about every building built by every council 50 years later was one of those high-rises, many of them with disastrous consequences. Many of them have since been knocked down. Not Le Corbusier's fault, more that was a poor interpretation of the new paradigm by local architects, leading to a whole bunch of social issues that weren't anticipated and certainly not designed out. However, high-rise blocks of flats still remain today, as does the use of reinforced concrete, which became more and more popular. Irreversible step change. Though we're not going back, we're not going to undo reinforced concrete. It remains a very good flexible material for low-cost construction. And then finally, in terms of an incomplete definition, the modern movement spawned all sorts of new design genres like Bauhaus, Passive House, and all those others that emerged at the same time. So that's an example there. So what does the new, let's say, sustainability paradigm look like? Well, does it meet these same 7 criteria? I would suggest it does, as did my PhD. So there's, like I say, it was awarded, therefore, by peer review. This is accepted then, that sustainability recognises this new paradigm because it's dealing with a crisis. We talked about that a little bit earlier. It's involved a return to first principles. What materials can we use? We are coming up with better solutions to the problem. So we're saving money, reducing emissions, reducing waste, improving health, and all these other things, which means that when we get to point 6 there, are we ever going to go back to less healthy ways of doing things that costs more and has a bigger toll on the environment and society? I don't think so. Resistance, we're seeing big pushback on point 4 there from the linear economy and from fossil fuel lobby. That is all now well documented. Gradual growth of support. We saw some beautiful work by the Extinction Rebellion and Net Zero Carbon movement to really move things in popular thinking and in corporate thinking. Irreversible step change. One example would be the ban on ozone depleting chemicals. We're never going back to those. They are history in the interests of sustainability. And then finally, incomplete definition. We're seeing all sorts of fabulous startups now inventing new ways to reuse materials and and all forms of waste in all sorts of different ways. So on that basis, it would appear that a more sustainable way of doing business and designing is consistent with a paradigm shift. And that means those of us who are investing our business models in doing that hopefully can see a way forward. Although, per that comment, point number, what was it, point 4 and point 5, resistance and gradual growth of support, the way that the adoption curve is shaped means that there are some early, very slow early movement with the innovators, the early adopters, and it's only when you get into the early majority and later majority do things start to accelerate. And of course, we can't anticipate the shape of the curve. However, one would hope that we're approaching a full adoption by around 2050 in order to hit our 1.5 degree temperature rise above pre-industrial levels that is generally considered by scientists to be a prudent approach to minimising all sorts of climate catastrophes. So slow at first, adopts at a rate that you can never predict because that depends on a whole bunch of different factors. So what sort of factors influences that? Well, I'll turn now, bringing things forward from Thomas Kuhn in 1962, Greg Lavery in the mid-1990s, right up to a bit more recently to the work of a chap called Damon Centola, who's a professor in California, who's a sociologist that studied for his whole career how change occurs. And there's two key points from his research, which I'm going to share here. Number one is what he identified is there are two types of change. One is around fashion and one is around beliefs. And I'll give you an example. So let's say Jay-Z or some other modern celebrity says that a certain type of trainer is very fashionable. What happens is he will post that, and then a whole bunch of other influencers will pick that up and repost that. And what you get is a very superficial change, but nevertheless people start changing what their trainers look like as a result of a series of linear interactions where someone receives a post, goes, okay, someone influential in the fashion space thinks this is interesting, I'll therefore change my trainers and I'll forward that on to other people. And it's very one single interaction leads to change, leads to others. Now that's because those changes are not particularly life-changing, there is no investment and there's no risk in those, it's all just about a pair of trainers, for example. However, what Centola realized is that's very, very different, and his experimentation showed that in order to change beliefs, it's not just an email from Jay-Z or any other celebrity that's going to change what any of us believe in. It's actually a whole network of interactions that happen when people day to day are saying many times, do you know there's this new thing out there which I think might be credible that we need to think about going forwards in what we do in our company, in our home lives, or whatever that looks like, even how we vote. All those sorts of belief changes come as a result of multiple interactions. And Centola talks about this sort of networking effect where it's not good enough for one person to say something to someone else. Actually, you need lots of multiple parallel interactions that lead to change happening of beliefs. And that's pretty powerful because that says how we go about influencing people around climate change shouldn't be saying the same thing from one person. What it should be is building a whole body of evidence and involving a whole bunch of people so that they can do the heavy lifting of mentioning and referring to that and suggesting that maybe there's a better way of doing things. And we've all seen those classic cartoons that talk about the fossil fuel saying, well, what have we got to, we've got all this to lose by moving to a more sustainable planet. And then some environmentalist says in a bubble above the cartoon, what, you mean we get a cleaner planet, a healthier living, better lifestyle, lower costs, etc., in juxtaposition to obviously the continued use of fossil fuels. So really interesting to get into this theory. And the other piece that I really wanted to share, so in this book by Centola called Change, How to Make Big Things Happen, available on Amazon for like £3 if you read it online, incredibly inexpensive but a really good read. And I'm going to summarize the two most important points. That one around network influence is the first most important point. The other really important point is that over decades of research, what he established is that if you have a room of people who are decision makers, in order to create a change or a majority decision to do something differently, you must have in that room at least 25% of the people with the new belief system or the new paradigm. And it's not 24, and if it's 26, you might have overinvested. But what he found, it is religiously 25% of that room need to have the new belief system in place. Now, this is incredibly powerful, and we changed our marketing based on this, because if we're going to convince people that a circular approach to, in our case, furniture, or for that matter, decarbonisation is required, And there are a group of people sitting around a table that are going to ultimately make that decision, whether be it in the construction industry. There are around that table a whole bunch of different actors, from cost consultants and clients and architects and project managers. That's a very diverse group. Or if it's an investment organisation that is going to make an investment in something, which probably is the investment committee, which probably has up to 12 different members in it, that means that at least 3 of those investment committee members must be familiar with the new investment and believe that that new investment and its paradigmatic model will be successful into the future. Now, unfortunately, most investment committees and investment companies don't work very efficiently, because they send one person to meet the company, and that one person has to go back and sell that idea into an investment committee. And if that investment committee is therefore more than 4 people, they will fail. Therefore, you could argue that the venture capital investment model will only ever invest in things it knows very well, because it's not able to mechanically invest in new paradigms. So you can see the sorts of thinking that can occur when you start to apply these rules of thumb developed empirically and quite rigorously by Damon and Centola, to say 25% of the room needs to have the new paradigm for change to occur. So that's, I'm going to pretty much finish there. I mean, that for me, that was really groundbreaking content when we came across it, and builds on, as I say, several decades of research, and comes to a point where you can say this is actually quite actionable. I can use this day to day in how I influence others to actually drive change in my organization, in my buying habits, in my personal life. And if you're a family of 4, you are empowered to make change happen that way in what you do at home. So some really useful information there, we think. Love to discuss with yourselves, see if you have any other research that you can add to this in the discussion. That would be very helpful. So to finish off then, just a reminder that we have one more in this series to go, which will occur in a couple of weeks on the 22nd of May, which is all about how to create social value through your low carbon office fit out. Some really interesting ideas there about creating local jobs for those furthest from the workforce. And then just a final reminder that you can catch up on any of the content from these modules at ripeoffice.com/academy, and look forward to the discussion after this.